The night was unnaturally still. Officer Daniel Mercer had been patrolling this stretch of town for over a decade, but something about tonight felt wrong. The houses lining the street sat in eerie silence, their windows black and vacant, like the hollowed-out eyes of a skull. As he turned onto Holloway Drive, a strange sensation crawled up his spine, an inexplicable pull, as though something unseen was guiding him. That's when he saw her. A small figure standing behind a second-story window, barely visible through the grime-streaked glass. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, her face pale and framed by tangled hair. She wasn't moving. She wasn't crying. She simply stared, her dark, hollow eyes locked onto him. And then, with deliberate slowness, she raised a trembling hand and pointed. Mercer's stomach twisted. The house she stood in, 304 Holloway Drive, had been vacant for years, but the girl's silent plea was unmistakable. She needed help, and she needed it now. The house that shouldn't be Mercer killed the engine, stepping out into the suffocating quiet. The house loomed before him, its warped wooden panels weathered by time. The stories about 304 Holloway Drive were well known. A family once lived here, until they didn't. No one spoke of what had happened, only that after that night, no one dared move in. Yet here, in the dead of night, a child stood inside its walls. Mercer reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Mercer checking out a possible trespassing at 304 Holloway Drive." Static. He frowned, trying again. More static. The radio was dead. His pulse quickened. He had 2 choices: call for backup or go in alone. The girl's hollow stare lingered in his mind. He made his choice. The inside wasn't empty. The front door groaned open with an agonizing creak, revealing a blackened hallway filled with the thick scent of decay. Mercer's flashlight beam cut through the dust-choked air, illuminating the peeling wallpaper, the broken furniture. But beneath the surface, something felt off. A presence. The silence was too deep, as if the house itself had been waiting, watching. A floorboard creaked above him. The little girl. Mercer tightened his grip on his flashlight and ascended the stairs, each step echoing ominously in the empty house. At the top, a long hallway stretched before him, doors lining each side like gaping mouths. The girl's room was at the end. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the rocking chair moved, back and forth, back and forth. But there was no one sitting in it. Mercer's breath hitched. The window stood open now, the same one where the girl had been standing just moments ago. His heart pounded. Where was she? The whisper. A soft whisper slid through the darkness, a child's voice. "He doesn't like when people come inside." Mercer spun, flashlight trembling in his grip. The girl stood in the doorway. Closer now, he could see how wrong she looked. Her skin too pale, her lips chapped and cracked, her dark eyes void of light. But it was her voice that made his blood run cold. It didn't sound human. It sounded like something mimicking a child. "You have to go," she whispered, "before he wakes up." The air shifted. A deep, guttural creak echoed from somewhere deep within the house. Mercer turned, every instinct screaming at him to run. And then he saw it. At the far end of the hallway, the shadows twisted, shifting into a shape that should not exist. Long fingers curled around the doorway, pulling a hulking, faceless figure into view. And then, it moved. Mercer barely had time to react before the light snapped out, plunging him into total darkness. The girl's whisper was the last thing he heard. "Now he sees you." Darkness swallowed everything. For a moment, Officer Daniel Mercer stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears. The flashlight was dead. The hallway had vanished. And then, the breathing began, deep, slow, wet. A sound so unnatural it sent a jolt of ice through Mercer's veins. It was close. The girl's whisper drifted from the void. "Don't move." Mercer obeyed, his body screaming at him to run. But then he heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, too heavy. They dragged across the floor, coming closer. The scent of rotting wood and something far worse filled the air. Mercer's fingers found his radio, but the moment he touched it, the breathing stopped. A silence so thick it pressed against his skull. And then, a voice. Low, gravelly, not human. You shouldn't have come here. Something huge lunged. The escaped Mercer didn't think, he ran. His boots pounded the warped wooden floor as he barreled down the hallway, heart slamming against his ribs. The thing behind him let out a guttural growl, the walls shaking as it moved. The girl was gone. The house shifted. The hallway felt longer, the air thicker. Mercer reached the stairs and leaped down 2 at a time. A sharp, splintering crack rang out. Something was crawling down the walls, fast. He hit the first floor and didn't stop. The front door was open, just a few more steps. A hand shot out from the darkness and grabbed his arm. Mercer whirled, his free hand instinctively reaching for his gun. The girl. She clutched his wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. Her fingernails were blackened, digging into his skin. Her voice was calm. It won't let you leave. Mercer yanked free. He dove through the doorway, and suddenly, he was outside. The air was cold. The streetlights flickered. His car sat where he left it. The house behind him was silent, as if nothing had ever happened. Mercer sucked in a shuddering breath, his pulse refusing to slow. He turned back. The girl stood at the window. She raised a finger to her lips. Shh. Something followed him. Mercer didn't sleep that night, or the night after. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back inside the house, running, hearing that voice whisper in his ear. His radio was still dead. His arm still ached where the girl had grabbed him. And then the scratching started. At first, he thought it was a branch tapping against his apartment window. But then he realized his apartment was on the 4th floor. At exactly 3:04 a.m., his phone buzzed. Unknown caller. His breath caught as he stared at the screen. The numbers blurred. 3:04. The address of the house. The call ended before he could answer. Then, a whisper from the darkness behind him. Now he sees you. Officer Daniel Mercer sat rigid in his apartment, the glow of his phone screen casting eerie shadows across his face. The call had ended, but the number 3:04 still burned in his mind. He forced himself to take a breath. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something had followed him home. A sharp scratching noise filled the room. His pulse spiked. The sound was coming from the window, 4 stories up. Mercer's throat went dry. He reached for his gun, creeping toward the glass. His hands were steady, his heart was not. With one swift motion, he yanked the curtain aside. Nothing. Just the empty street below, bathed in the flickering glow of a dying streetlight. Then, a reflection, behind him. Something tall, something with no face. Mercer spun around, gun raised. Nothing, just the dimly lit apartment. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. His skin prickled. The air was wrong. He turned back to the window and nearly stumbled backward. A single bloody handprint was smeared across the glass. Small, child-sized. The investigation Mercer didn't sleep. He spent the rest of the night watching, waiting. But the scratching didn't return. By morning, he had made a decision. He needed to go back to 304 Holloway Drive. The house looked the same, silent, abandoned. But the moment Mercer stepped inside, the air shifted. The door creaked shut behind him, trapping him in its depths once more. He tightened his grip on his flashlight. This time, he wasn't leaving without answers. He started upstairs, past the peeling wallpaper and dust-choked air. Then he heard it. A whimper. A child's sob, muffled, coming from behind a closed door at the end of the hallway. The same room where he had seen the little girl. Mercer swallowed hard. He reached for the doorknob. The wood was ice cold. He pushed the door open, and inside, the rocking chair was moving again, back and forth, back and forth. But this time, someone was sitting in it. The woman in the chair. Her back was to him, long, stringy hair draping over her shoulders. Her head rocked with the motion of the chair, slow and rhythmic. The air felt thick, suffocating. Mercer's instincts screamed at him to leave. But then she spoke. A low, fragile whisper. He doesn't like when people come back. His blood ran cold. "Who are you?" he asked, voice steadier than he felt. The woman gave a slow, painful sigh. "You should have listened." Mercer reached for his radio, but the second he moved, the chair stopped rocking. The room fell deathly silent. Then, the woman's head snapped backward, but her body didn't move. Mercer barely had time to register the horror before she lunged, her face a hollow, gaping void. The flashlight flickered. Darkness swallowed the room, and Mercer heard the whisper again. "Now you belong to him." The darkness was suffocating. Officer Daniel Mercer couldn't see, couldn't move. The whisper still echoed in his ears. "Now you belong to him." Then, the breathing began. Deep, slow, right next to him. His fingers fumbled for his gun, but something was wrong. The air felt thick, pressing against his chest like unseen hands. His arms felt heavy, as if something was pulling him downward, deeper into the black void that had swallowed the room. Then, a hand clamped onto his wrist. Small, cold, unnaturally strong. The girl. Her grip tightened as she whispered, "He's watching." Mercer's breath hitched. He could feel her too close. But then, something changed. The air shifted, the pressure lifted, and suddenly, the room snapped back into existence. The woman in the rocking chair was gone. The dust-choked air was still, but the girl was still holding his wrist. This time, Mercer could see her up close. Her eyes were darker than before, empty, lifeless, like she wasn't really there. She tilted her head, studying him. "You need to go now." Mercer swallowed. "Not without you." A shadow passed behind her, a tall, hulking shape shifting within the darkness. The girl's expression didn't change. She just shook her head. "You don't understand." Mercer's gut twisted. The thing in the hallway moved. It was coming. The haunting escape Mercer grabbed the girl's hand and bolted. The moment they crossed the threshold into the hallway, the house roared to life. The walls trembled, the floor buckled beneath them, the air rippled, warping like heat waves in the dead of summer. Mercer didn't look back. Something was chasing them. He could feel it, the crushing presence at his back. They reached the stairs. The girl stumbled. Mercer caught her, heart hammering. Almost there. Then, from behind them, a deep, guttural growl. And suddenly, Mercer was yanked backward. A hand, a clawed, unnatural hand had wrapped around his ankle, pulling him into the darkness. He kicked, thrashed, but it was too strong. The girl's face remained expressionless. She did not try to save him, and that's when Mercer realized she had never been trying to leave. She had been keeping him here. A low whisper slid through the air. "Now you see." The world tilted, and the darkness swallowed him whole. What was left behind? When Mercer's eyes opened, he was somewhere else. A room, dimly lit. The rocking chair creaked, and this time, he was the one sitting in it. His body felt strange, heavy, like he wasn't quite himself. He turned his head, movement slow and stiff. The little girl stood by the window. Her dark, empty eyes stared into his. A faint smile tugged at her lips. Then, she raised a hand and pointed. Mercer followed her gaze, and his breath caught in his throat. Outside on the street below, a police car had just pulled up, and standing beside it was him. Another Officer Mercer, staring up at the window. just as he had done before. The girl whispered one last time, "Now it begins again." Officer Daniel Mercer sat frozen in the rocking chair. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Outside the window, he saw himself. The other Mercer stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the house with the same unsettled look he had worn just nights before. It didn't make sense. How was he out there when he was in here? The girl at the window turned back to him, smiling. She stepped closer, her hollow, dark eyes boring into him. "Now you understand." Mercer's voice came out hoarse. What is this?" The girl tilted her head. "You're home now." A chill crawled down his spine. Home? No, this wasn't his home. This was the house, the cursed place that had trapped him. The girl's small fingers reached out and pressed against his chest. Instantly, Mercer's body felt wrong, like his limbs weren't his own anymore, like he was fading. A distant voice echoed in his head, distorted and stretched like a record warping. "You shouldn't have come back." Mercer squeezed his eyes shut. He had to wake up. This was a nightmare. It had to be. But then, a deafening knock shattered the silence. Mercer's eyes flew open. The other him was at the front door, knocking. Just like he had done before. Just like he had always done. And suddenly, he remembered. The truth of Holloway Drive. Flashes of memories, or were they lives, rushed through Mercer's mind. Different cops, different times. They all came to the house. They all saw the girl in the window. And they all ended up here, trapped, forgotten, replaced. The girl wasn't begging for help. She was baiting them. The moment an officer stepped inside, the house took them. Their body would be erased from the outside world, a ghost in the real world, while their soul rotted inside. Mercer's stomach churned. How many had come before him? How many Mercers had knocked on that door? The final choice. The knocking grew louder. Mercer turned to the girl, desperation in his eyes. "Let me go." Her face remained expressionless. "You belong here now." He grabbed her shoulders. I don't belong here." Her blackened eyes flickered with something, pity, amusement. "You have one choice," she whispered. And then, the front door creaked open. The other Mercer stepped inside. The air shivered. Time looped. Mercer's vision blurred, his body growing cold. He felt himself slipping, his voice, his thoughts, his existence. The cycle was starting again, and this time he would be nothing more than a shadow, a silent presence in the house, just like all the others. The final whisper. Outside, the lights of the police cruiser flickered. The real world moved on, and from the upstairs window, the little girl watched, waiting for the next visitor, for the next soul to take his place. She smiled softly, her lips barely moving as she whispered, "Shh, don't fight it. It's already over." The rocking chair creaked, and the house was hungry once more. The end.